Today, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Becky Anderson, managing editor of CNN Abu Dhabi and host of Connect the World, CNN's flagship primetime news show broadcast weekdays from the UAE capital. And in case you're wondering about the backdrop, today you join me from our temporary broadcasting site at Expo 2020 in Dubai, where we are an official broadcaster. Right, let's get to it. 2021 looks set to be a year of recovery for the Middle East and Central Asia, but after a difficult economic and social crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, this recovery will take some time, and it certainly won't be straightforward. Risks such as inflation, mounting debt, unemployment threaten a retreat from post-pandemic growth. Divergent vaccine rollouts across the region have only hampered what are already struggling economies, but there could be opportunities to build more resilient economies using the lessons learned from the last 18 months or so. Expanding digital technologies, for example, reducing the role of the state, addressing climate change. These are key messages of the regional Middle East and Central Asia IMF team, which has released its economic outlook titled Tradeoffs Today for Transformation Tomorrow. Look, real GDP is projected to grow 4.1% in 21 and 2022, following the sharp contraction last year. But this growth is tempered by lingering risks from that pandemic and some familiar problems that have troubled some countries in this region for years. Well, joining me to give us an in-depth analysis into the outlook are my esteemed guests today. Firstly, Jihad Azor, who is the director of the IMF in the Middle East and Central Asia. Badr Jaffer is the CEO of the Crescent Enterprises in the UAE. Sharif Kamal is the dean of the School of Business at the American University in Cairo. And finally, Monica Malik, chief economist at Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank. Well, before we begin, and thank you, all of you, for joining us today. Before we begin, a quick set of house rules for you, if you don't mind, for our audience. This seminar is available in Arabic via the Zoom link. Audience members can also ask questions through our Zoom chat, some of which I will put to our panel towards the end of this conversation. And I would also politely ask that those listening, please mute yourselves. Right, Jihad, I want to start with you. The regional economic outlook is out. What were the key findings, sir?
Well, Becky, thank you very much. And again, thank you and thanks to the other members of this panel. Let me share with you a few highlights. I think you have started by very nicely painting where we stand today. First, it's a region that is going through a recovery since the beginning of the year. And we are, I would say, at a crossroad. At crossroad because we have already seen that the region is recovering. Yet, as you said, the recovery is uneven. Uneven in a sense that there are countries who almost have catched up and recovered all the ground lost since the outbreak of the crisis. But you have a certain number of countries that are lagging behind. And the question is why? I think that the first answer for that is the combination of two things. One is vaccination. Countries who have accelerated vaccination and invested immediately on fighting the COVID as a crisis succeeded in accelerating recovery. And related to that is not fighting the COVID using only one instrument, but a multiple of instruments. Saving lives, saving livelihoods was the slogan, but I think it made a big difference. Therefore, countries who have inoculated vaccines very quickly, countries who have put a mix of policies on the fiscal side by supporting sectors that were affected, monetary and financial, were able to recover faster. In March, April this year, we said that accelerating vaccination could give you an additional 0.5% of growth. And we saw it. Country like, for example, Saudi was able to grow faster because of that. Therefore, we're seeing a kind of a natural cyclical recovery, but this recovery is also showing certain number of challenges. What has been added this time is two additional factors. Inflation, and this is something that is global, affected the region, and I would say the acute part of this inflation is driven by basic commodity and food prices, which is socially will have an impact on the region. The second is the fast and sharp recovery of oil price, doubled in 1 year, and gas price quadrupled in 1 year. This is a blessing for some, curse for others. Therefore, this is where we stand today. If we look at the next year or two, what are the key issues? And here we have to look at what we are left with after a year and a half of fighting the COVID. One, we are left with a picture where technology has made a big difference. And when you look at the recovery, you see that there is scarring in sectors that are traditional. Usually, informality was a protection against shocks. We saw this in 2008 after the global financial crisis. We saw that also in 2014, 15. It's not the case anymore. What is important is technology, because technology recovered faster. The second thing that also was important is the corporate sector has recovered. And this is a good news. But here behind the first picture, you have also divergence. Small companies are more affected in their liquidity, and some of them will face some solvency issue. Therefore, we expect this year, because we made the focus on the corporate sector, that we will have between 12 to 20% or 25%, depends on the scenario. We could have a restructuring of certain sectors. Liquidity is going to be very important. And this also will bring me to the third point, policies. But before getting there, I think there is another important issue, which is inclusion. The effort to reduce the disparities over the years is tested, because youth, women are the most affected by the crisis. Informality also was affected, and unemployment went up 1.5%. And at the youth level is very high. This is an issue that needs to be addressed. And let me bring me to my last point. How to go there from there? Policies. Policies are going to be important. And the first message is accelerate. You need to accelerate starting the vaccine. Accelerating vaccine is very important, because this is what will help countries have a predictable recovery. This is what help countries can focus on sectors that need special assistance. In addition to accelerating the vaccination, you need to accelerate the transformation. This crisis was an accelerator by excellence. It accelerated certain number of trends. You need to understand what those trends are and be at the forefront of those. We are looking forward to see, for example, how environmental strategies are going to change. Next week, we will see a certain number of announcements. What UAE did by saying in 2050, zero carbon emission, it's huge if we go back 5 or 10 years ago. How this is going to happen, this will require a lot of investment. Some countries can, some countries cannot, and this is where the role of cooperation is going to be important, and I will say what the fund could do and will do. Second, you need also to accelerate your transformation to increase your productivity. This region has been facing a low level of productivity. Increasing productivity will also allow you to be part of the new value chain. We are in a kind of a postmodern globalization where we will see new trends developing. And therefore, if we don't accelerate our understanding, our issues, our adaptation, if we don't accelerate our regional cooperation in science, technology, in a certain number of fields, we will not be able to compete globally. 3 is you need to include. I think inclusion is going to be the key issue. Social proof to be very important. You need to address labor scarring. You need to address it through increasing education and investing in building capacity and skills. This will improve the productivity of labor. Last but not the least, I think also you need to calibrate your policies, because here central banks are faced with inflation, what to do. It's very important to be vigilant on that. Government need to reduce debt in many of the countries where debt is high. You need to know how to unwind some of the measures and put yourself in a sustainable macro situation where you rebuild your buffers. Last but not the least, you need to recalibrate the way you invest and where you put your investment. And this brings me to my last, I would say my concluding points, where the international community is. We at the fund, we reacted very quickly last year. We provided $20 billion. It helped countries like Egypt with a massive support of $8.5 billion to stabilize very quickly. maintain growth. We had a country like Morocco who was able to be one of the countries that are benefiting from the recovery. Going forward with the SDRs, 650 billion globally for the region, almost 45 billion. The importance is to have the right use for that. Increase your reserves, your liquidity, invest in the future, accelerate when you need your healthcare and vaccination. Therefore, it's a fascinating moment where we are today. There are, of course, many challenges that need to be addressed, but I think it needs to start by shifting a bit the way we look at issues. Becky, you are mute. I think maybe you need to unmute. Becky, I think you're mute.
Right, do you have me?
Yes, we hear you now.
Great, good stuff. All right, that was my technical team behind the scenes. They've got me back in business. Fantastic, thank you. Those are key findings and a sort of prescription for where we go next. I want to bring in now our other esteemed panelists. Monica, let me get to you first. Slow vaccination rates, rising inflation, high public debt. There are clearly many risks facing this region right now, and Jihad has also laid out some potential trends that will help accelerate a recovery. To your mind, how are countries dealing with those risks as we move towards an end of this pandemic, if indeed that is what we face at this point?
Hi, Becky. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I think what we've seen is both a very uneven recovery and uneven policy response. Sitting in the GCC, we've actually seen a very, very proactive response from the governments here. Very strong vaccination programs. And what we've seen is really from the mid of last year, you've seen economies opening up and economic activity returning. Of course, there's going to be significant differences by country and by sector. So as Jihad mentioned, Saudi Arabia, non-oil activity, which is very domestic facing, has already returned to pre-pandemic levels with the opening up of the economy. In the UAE, also, we've seen domestic activity pick up. And now, as the impact of the pandemic wanes globally, we're seeing recovery in the tourism sector and the more externally facing sectors. So this will take, many years to recover fully. But I think a couple of things that really stand out from the GCC perspective. One, we've seen a focus on reforms and a focus on new drivers of growth. So really, we've seen reforms in increasing FDI, in increasing the sort of role of expatriates in the UAE, trying to bring private investment coming in, PPP reforms, other sort of administrative reforms as well. And the focus has also been on stabilizing the fiscal position, which has also benefited from the sharp rise in oil prices. So we see a marked improvement on the fundamentals. They've also front-loaded their borrowing requirements, taking advantage of the low investment, the low interest rate environment. For the non-GCC countries, really the recovery is being impacted by the weaker vaccination programs. And there we see sort of vaccination programs lagging behind the global emerging market trends. You're going to see the double impact for some countries, the oil importers, of high oil prices. And you've seen sort of countries like Egypt, the impact of tourism impacted by the weak vaccinations. You've seen high interest rates to make sure capital inflows come in. So that's one factor which is necessary and very important for funding requirements, but will slow the domestic recovery. And also across, we've seen sort of tight fiscal policy to try and sort of reduce debt levels, again, which is necessary, but impacts the recovery.
No, fascinating. Obviously, this isn't a recovery that is consistent across the board. But let me come to you. The pandemic has hit some groups unequally, and Jihad alluded to this, women, youngsters, those who are less skilled. Small firms have been impacted massively, and yet we are seeing signs of recovery. Your business, well diversified across a number of strategic sectors, regionally and indeed globally, not least in energy, in logistics, and indeed in venture capital. From a private sector standpoint, what trends do you see emerging at this point?
So as has been highlighted in the IMF's report, and as you've just said now, the region's performance, as you look across its 20 or so countries, is as diverse as the 500 million or so people living in it. You just need to compare the scenes behind you at Expo in Dubai with what you're seeing three or 4 hours away in Lebanon to illustrate that. So it can be misleading, of course, to generalize MENA. The report's conclusions are clear. However, I'd like to highlight three other macro trends that I believe are very positive for the region, and if properly embraced, can have a major positive influence on its economic and socio-economic trajectory in the years to come. The first is the rise of venture capital. You know, we've been saying for years that the only way we can break the stubborn cycle of youth unemployment is by empowering small businesses to generate jobs. The problem is nobody wanted to invest in small businesses. Well, I hope that that's changing. In the last few years, we've seen record amounts of capital flowing to startups, over $1.2 billion in the first half of this year alone, which was a 60% increase on last year. Crescent Enterprises, our corporate venture capital arm, CE Ventures, has itself invested $200 million in the past 3 years, over half of which is in the region. Of course, we have a long way to go. The venture capital funding as a percentage of GDP in the MENA is 10 times less than the US. But the momentum is certainly there. And we now need to ensure that we allocate more capital to growth stage businesses, improve also the infrastructure to facilitate exits and returns on investments, and of course, improve regulation to make it easier for these businesses to raise money. The second point I'd like to highlight is the ESG phenomenon. For years, I've been saying the only way we're going to stand a chance at overcoming our numerous social and environmental challenges we face in the region is if we as businesses identify with the business case for adopting these principles as an intrinsic part of our business models. Again, at Crescent Enterprises, we've been reporting on our sustainability journey for 10 years now. And I really believe, Becky, that we're finally seeing a real conscious effort and shift in focus towards ESG and sustainability more broadly in the region, beyond just whitewashing. Now, this can be huge, as it could mean that we're recruiting hundreds of thousands of agents of positive change in the region, each with the potential to make an impact on the economic and social indicators that Jihad outlined. And finally, the empowerment of the private sector itself. Look, I mean, as we all know, trust is the most important intangible commodity in any society or economy. And as trust in business globally rises, well, at least according to the Edelman Trust Barometer, I'm seeing a similar trend in our region, with the private sector increasingly seen as an essential partner to achieve our region's nation goals. And this is even more relevant with the geo-economic pivot that we're also witnessing with related competition, of course, heating up. Take the UAE, for example, where one of the first of our principles of the 50 to mark 50 years of the Union is to completely focus on building the best and most dynamic economy in the world. Now, we've already seen streams of new regulation in parts of the region aimed at trying to make it easier for businesses to thrive. Of course, we must work harder to ensure that that empowerment is inclusive, both geographically as well as demographically. For example, I noticed reading the Arab Youth Survey for 2021 that around 80% of women surveyed say that they are concerned about the lack of opportunities to join the workforce. And this is a worrying trend that we must reverse with urgency.
Yeah. Making some extremely important points. The transition digitally that we have seen sort of forced to a certain extent on so many people during COVID. And of course, this isn't constant across the board, but you certainly see it in this country and in so many places around the world. Sharif, what do you see as the opportunities afforded by that? This was a consolation, if you will, from the pandemic.
Thank you, Becky. And let me just start by wishing everybody to stay safe and in good health. I hope we've seen the worst of the pandemic. I just hope that. And but still, we're not out of it yet. So getting back to your point, let me just step back for a minute. Digital transformation, in my view, started when we started having personal computers at home. This was the beginning, early 80s. And then came the internet, and then came mobiles, and came social media, and then came the fourth industrial revolution. Throughout that 40 years, when we talked about disruption, we actually thought that disruption was the technology that is disrupting our lives. 2019 had a different surprise, bad surprise. Call it a pandemic, call it an enemy, call it a stealth attack, but actually the disruption came through the pandemic. Technology, in my view, in some way, obviously there is no one size that fits all, came to save the day. And I think this is here to stay. And we already have been seeing new trends in the future of learning, the future of work, how we can impact culture, manufacturing, and what have you, across different spectrum of life in different industries and businesses. Well, moving forward, we all talk about change. We push for change. We promote change. We preach change. But deep inside, nobody wants to change. I think what happened late in 2019 and 2020, people actually started to change because maybe they didn't have another option. And they saw some solutions to move on with their lives using technology. Obviously, across the region, again, there is no one size that fits all. What are the key points that companies should be looking at? I would start not with infrastructure, but with people, the human capital. Extremely important. We've seen across the region, again, with different variations, gaps in the market. You talk to employers, they're looking for people. You look to graduates, they don't find a job. There is a mismatch here. What they need to learn and how they need to learn it. What they need to adapt to and what they need to adopt. So the human capital, whether it's the capacities, the skills, the degrees, or more importantly, the vocational trainings comes on top. Second would be the infrastructure. And the universal infrastructure so that we do not actually exacerbate the already existing problems by actually widening the gap of the divide. I wouldn't say the digital divide, the divide at large. And third, which is extremely important, the governance model. How we can put all this together in one sort of holistic, working, impactful ecosystem. Having said that, the impact, going back, zooming in onto your question, was on individual and SMEs. I see that we talk most of the time on the level of access. It's not just the level of access for SMEs, it's also the level of adoption and how can technology help them create value. I think across the board, we haven't seen much of that. And I completely agree with Badr, the point about venture capital growing into, over the past 10 years plus in the region. We're still scratching the surface, but we're going in the right direction. Investing in youth. I mean, the one thing we have abundance of in this region is youth. I want to see in every single higher education institution, I think we have almost 1,000 of them in the region, a university-based incubator that focuses on critical thinking, innovation, creativity, and would push people to go and start up businesses and impact the community. Because ICT, if you look at it vertically, it can be a very promising sector in each and every economy. And we've seen, for example, in the case of Egypt, it has been growing by 16% for the past 3 years. And I believe the last year it contributed 4% to GDP. In the next few years, the target is to reach 8%. But also, and more importantly, horizontally, and the impact on healthcare, on transportation, on logistics, on agriculture, on manufacturing, and I can go on and on and on. But to focus on what opportunities does it open for those companies? Bigger markets, more efficiency, better rationalization of resources. So in a nutshell, it is what we make out of it. And again, there is no one size that fits all, but surely the business mantra should be business is not as usual. And this is more of an opportune moment, and we need to turn that challenge into an opportunity.
And you see that challenge being turned into an opportunity in many countries across this region. Again, what you're saying, very familiar to people who live here in the UAE, in Saudi and elsewhere. This is not a story that we see playing out in the likes of Lebanon, in Syria, in various other places where things are really tough. Jihad, countries will have to make some trade-offs as this recovery continues, when to withdraw financial support, for example, if indeed they are able to provide that, and in some cases they can't. I just wonder, I think it's important for our audience to hear from you how the IMF has been helping countries ease through these trade-offs, and we must address the issue of inflation. Wealthy countries wrestling with, as you rightly pointed out, inflation stoked up by pent-up demand, by supply chain bottlenecks, by higher energy and commodity prices. How concerned are you that an abrupt tightening of monetary policy in the US or in Europe, for example, could have a devastating knock-on effect on outflows from some of the countries in this region considered developing countries? Mute.
Sorry,
Thank you.
I was muted. Becky, you have raised the real questions here. Trade-offs are going to be very important. Of course, I think Barry said it, countries are different. There are a certain number of common trends and there are different features. The common trends, the region is faced with low growth, low productivity, high unemployment, and for certain cases, high debt. Therefore, those trends need to be addressed. We need to increase productivity. Labor productivity is very important. We need to invest more because investment will also allow the economy of the region to grow faster. But let me zoom in more specifically. And here I need to separate between oil exporting and oil importing countries. For the oil exporting countries, what are the trade-offs today? One is to use this windfall that we saw over the last 6 months as a way to accelerate the transformation that is coming. Maybe it's not in 2050, maybe it could be in 2040, but it's coming. And I see that they have already started, and I see promising trends. Diversification of sectors, it's happening. It needs to put more the private sector in the leading spot, and also put the startups, those who are innovating, those who will grow fast also in leading position and provide through access to finance support to those. The region is still suffering from low access to finance. They need also to address the issue of diversifying their revenues. And we saw that progressing. We saw last year, Bahrain, or this year, Oman, and before that last year, Saudi, adjusting their revenue base in order to be less dependent on oil. They need to accelerate their transformation of the labor market. And here also, increasing women participation was very useful for Saudi. Increasing flexibility in the labor market for expats also is helping the countries to recover. Therefore, this is a kind of transformation that those countries need. For the oil importing countries, you have two categories. You have, or I would say 3 categories. You have those who are able to transform. I will take the example of Morocco. Morocco is a country that faced with the same issues 10 years ago, have introduced certain number of reforms. Now they are recovering at a high speed. They are, in fact, benefiting from the increasing demand globally to increase their export. Other countries need to do the same. We see Egypt improving the macro over the last few years, building up reserves, changing the way they address public finance. The challenge is to keep the pace of transformation for the economy to keep growing at 5.5%. In Egypt, you need 700 to 800 new jobs per year, 1,000 jobs per year. For that, only the private sector can do. And you have for that to calibrate your policies, because that is an overhang. And you raised a very important question. How to do if we see a change in policies? We saw that last year. And in our report, we in fact assessed the impact of, I would say, change in policies on countries. And here, those who have buffers, those who are able to show that they have the capacity to consolidate over the medium term, are going to succeed. In April, we did a special focus on the nexus between sovereign and banks. And we show that over the last year and a half, the financing of the state relied more on local banks. I think the development of local capital markets with those in the UAE and other countries is a step in the right direction. And you have another group that is, I would say, those who need real support: Lebanon, Tunisia, and other countries. Those are countries with great potential, two countries with huge human capital, but they need to adjust their policies. What the fund is doing, in fact, the fund is helping at 3 levels. Policy level, which we think it's the most important one, is helping countries design the right reforms. Recently, we did a big study on reforming state-owned entities. If you do this, you can improve your performance by 2%, because it's costing the treasury 2%. 2% is what countries on average are spending on social protection. Look how you can accelerate and improve your inclusion. We did also a study that will come in a few weeks on climate and climate adaptation. And here also, this is a macro-critical issue for the region too. Therefore, policies and our policy support is key, but we understand that financial is also important. And last year, through rapid facilities, we helped countries address the shock and bring more credibility. And this is what helped countries to regain access to market. Today, countries have access to market, which is a very positive step, but they need to benefit from it because we don't know how the winds could change. And if the wind change, the volatility in the region is higher than other parts of the world. The last point where the fund is helping is how to bring together, and this is something that through the SDRs, further cooperation. And with this new trust fund, we're trying to help countries who cannot invest in the future use the SDRs in countries where they have excess in order to accelerate also their transformation for a greener recovery, for recovery that invests in digital and technology. Therefore, now it's our role as an institution with others to be a bit the accelerator or the support to accelerate those transformations.
Jihad, I'm just going to bring in our other panelists for one more question each off the back of some of what you have just laid out. I want to get the perspective from the private sector, and I do then know that we've got a number of questions from the audience. So let's keep our questions, our answers relatively tight so we can get to as many of these audience questions as possible. Monica, let me just come to you first. Banks have been largely resilient during this crisis. Again, this isn't consistent across the board, but let's just make the point that they've been largely resilient. How can the banking sector support the private sector as it emerges from this pandemic?
Well, I think they've played a very, very important role. And the fact is that much of the economic support that went to the real economy during the pandemic went through the banks, made sure that the government made sure there was ample liquidity, that there was lending to the real economy. And I think, now that economies are improving, that, we are starting to see that reflect in banking sector data, the fact that some of the loans are being paid off. I think the critical point on the role of the banking sector really will be to support the private sector going forward, because, we've coming to the point where I think there's increased focus that much of the new developments, new growth will come from private sector or GREs. And a lot of countries have very large investment environments and will be looking for capital. Saudi is a clear case, and it's not going to be just external capital, or the bond markets, but also being able to access domestic liquidity and get support from the banking sector. Again, there's marked differences in the health and the strength of the banking sector. For the weaker economies, to strengthen the banking sector, that's going to be very important. Finally, I think, one thing that's going to be very positive is that as the economies are recovering and we are going to start seeing the withdrawal of some of these support measures, what we're seeing is that it's going to be very much calibrated with economic growth, and that's very positive. That's also giving time for banks to speak both to the corporate sector and the retail sector to start repaying loans and dealing with that unwinding. As confidence is built up, we are also seeing credit growth across the region picking up, both retail and credit and corporate. And that's very positive to start seeing.
Thank you. Sharif, let me just come to you. I do want to talk about the public sector's role here as well. There are exceptions, of course, but the public sector in a lot of countries across this region is frankly inefficient. Has the pandemic taught us any lessons about governance and accountability in the public sector? I think that's important to just discuss at this point.
Oh boy, that's a very important question, and I think the answer could be a game changer if the right answer is put in place. Absolutely, digitization, what it can do, but let me just start by saying there is automation, there is digitization, and there is digital economy, and the three are different. Starting off with the first, because many people think, let's just automate the processes that we have. Well, if we automate an efficient process, it becomes inefficient, but still automated. But we're not talking about that. We're looking at, yes, an inefficient, bureaucratic, full of red tape, and let me just address the elephant in the room, corrupt in many ways. Digitization can help with that, can help push for data-driven policies, can help to make to break the silos, then can help to put the entire operation more efficient and more effective. And obviously, it contributes to the governance model. It's not just that. I think in many of the problems we have across the region is the silos. Everybody works on vertical by himself or herself. So if digitization can help break those silos, and I think that's extremely important to bring in a more inclusive model that can help economic development. I see digitalization leading to the digital economy, and this is just a means to an end for economic development. So we're not really interested in the technology itself, but we're interested in what technology can do to individuals, to organizations, and to society at large. We cannot do that unless there is equity through digitization, and that can only happen with universal access, but also, again, going back to the point, because it's important. It's not just the community that needs to get trained, but also the decision makers needs to get trained to be able to know what are the advantages that can be used in that can be realized in using those technology. What remains the biggest challenges? I start by saying, again, people, resistance to change. It's the mindset, it's the culture. But still, am I optimistic? Absolutely. And building again on the massive youth in the entire community. Sure. I believe 60% are under the age of 30. The second is the buy-in of the decision makers. Should we go in that direction or not? The third is across the board, the shortage of the digital talents and skills. And I referred to that in my previous answer. And the fourth and final is the teamwork, the collaborative work together between different elements of the entire ecosystem. I'll give you one example that could be a game changer: financial inclusion. And if I pick an example again from Egypt, you look at the numbers here. Only 32% of the adult population, which means 16 years old and older, bank their money. 32%. So that leaves 68%. Not in the system. So if you bring in a portion of that into the formal economy, look at the impact, and then it becomes sort of a dominoes effect. So I think it creates opportunities across different sectors, and definitely it can help have a more rightly sized government size that works together and that is more efficient and effective.
Yeah, no, fascinating. I mean, I don't doubt that there are an enormous amount of lessons about governance and accountability in the public sector, but as we move through and out of this pandemic, given the varying degrees of success traditionally by governments across this region in response to economic shocks, it's been very clear from this conversation and from conversations that you have around the region that this recovery needs businesses to be part of the solution. So given your experience and your insight, do you genuinely believe that the private sector is doing enough to transform itself in the post-COVID world? Bottom line, can it have the impact that we've been discussing here?
So in many ways, the pandemic, I think, forced sectors to work together around the world. The vaccine drive is a clear example of a successful public, private, and people partnership. And without government incentives and effective regulation, private sector innovation, and community engagement, we would have seen many millions of more lives lost and economies and healthcare systems completely collapse. The MENA region is no different. And so I hope that the experiences of the past 18 months or so will provide inspiration as to the models of collaboration and cooperation that we need to see in the region if we are to overcome our most difficult challenges. As I said, businesses have no choice today but to be on the front lines of this mission. I've been preaching this for 20 years or so, but I think we're finally reaching a tipping point where profit is being seen as fundamentally compatible with social and environmental outcomes without it being a zero-sum game. And this is something that we must continue to encourage and celebrate. A final word on this, and it's one of caution, which is that as we move to empowering the private sector, we must also make sure that we promote a level playing field by ensuring that government doesn't inadvertently hamper business by competing with it. This, as far as I'm concerned, is the most powerful thing that regulators can do to allow business to do what it does best. As the IMF's report highlights, a key requirement for this transformational recovery of the whole region really is a reorient of the role of the state with a focus on things like health, education, providing social safety nets, and very importantly, pursuing competition-enhancing regulatory reform to identify and reduce fiscal risks whilst promoting private sector innovation and growth.
We are 45 minutes through what is an hour session. This has been terrific. I want to pause for just a moment to take some questions that have come in from the audience. People have been sending them in while we have been chatting. Nasser Saidi asks if the panel can discuss the digital divide in the region and its impact on recovery and growing inequality. More importantly, he asks, how is working from home and learning from home being implemented across the region? Let me hold that thought. I've got another question here because we can divvy these out for answers. Another question from the audience asking about the role that fighting corruption could have in promoting growth in the region. What are the panel's views on that? Who wants to start? Jihad, let's start with you on either of those questions.
Well, thank you very much. Very quickly, I agree very well with what Nasser said. Data is showing that technology helped in many cases bridge the gap and or divide. Bridge the gap, we saw this, for example, in countries like Morocco, where 5 million families in informality got support because of digital. It helped bridge the gap because also it helped remittances to accelerate and expat workers to support through the lifeline that they provide to their people with a very efficient payment system. But it's also a divide because we're seeing the recovery here accelerating for sectors where technology play an important role and traditional sectors lagging behind. And therefore, investing in 5G, investing in infrastructure, standardizing the nature of technology is very important. After this meeting, we will have a meeting with the governors of central bank. We are going to discuss central bank digital currency. And this is going to be an important issue. Therefore, succeeding in the future requires investing in technology. Fighting corruption is definitely an important issue. Trust is at the essence of any economic and social system, and also at the essence of recovery. And studies are showing, we did one recently, a few months ago, that is showing that if you improve transparency and accountability in fiscal and monetary management, you could have a very positive impact on growth. And also, you could provide an additional premium to any investment that you could attract. Over the last 10 years, the region was suffering from very low level of FDRs. And one of the reasons is that I think the new partnership, as I fully agree with better public, private, and people, is in avenue for that. And this goes to how policies need to be calibrated, because the support that the state provided last year was very welcome. Now it's a time to recalibrate, focus on those who need, and rebuild buffer. And the state should retrench from being inoperative. This is difficult because government have this tendency when they expand, they have a difficulty to recalibrate. And I think one of the elements today is they need to recalibrate fast. Otherwise, we will not see the economy regaining speed in recovery.
Bada, your perspective.
On the corruption point, look, corruption is a disease that will eat away at the fabric of the economy and our societies until they are dead. And so there is no hope unless we root this out and we deal with it. It's a systemic issue, and it's one that has to be dealt with head on. As you know, Becky, we launched the Pearl Initiative about 10 years ago to look to promote the business case behind corporate governance and accountability, transparency, but also really dealing with this issue of corruption. What does it mean in our businesses, in our economies, in our societies? And how can we make sure we root it out? I've seen a change in attitudes to corruption more broadly over the last 10 years, but there's a lot more that we can do and need to do. And I'm talking about specifically the Gulf. Of course, as we just discussed, the situation is very different and diverse as you go across different parts of the region. On just quickly, the digital question, the smartphone penetration in the Middle East and North Africa is amongst the highest in the world, pushing, I think, 70%. And many countries are taking digitization very, very seriously. The Gulf region alone plans to invest over $70 billion by 2024. And we know how transformative, effective digitization can be on all our systems, as has been mentioned, healthcare, education, and of course, commerce. Of course, we must make sure that as has been raised, that in parallel with physical and digital infrastructure, we're also investing in skills, digital skills, to ensure that we're using technology to its maximum potential, and importantly, using it to empower change makers to address our challenges. Just a final point I'll mention on digitization, again, something I was reading the other day, where 50% cost of available broadband exceeds affordability in 50% of developing countries, and an estimated 47% of people worldwide are still offline. Also, there's a huge gap in accessibility and access, I guess, to digital tools between large businesses and small businesses. And interestingly, women are also left out more often than not in many of these developing markets. So these are all areas that policymakers and businesses need to work together to make sure that we address.
Thank you, Bada. Sharif.
Let me address the point of digitalization and the impact. So the question was working from home. I would say working from anywhere, not just from home. We're still scratching the surface, maybe working on the go. And that's exactly what we do. And I'll give various examples. One of the major challenges that's facing the region is actually the percentage of unemployment among women and youth. Well, digitization actually opens up immense opportunities for both segments. And look at the gig economy, and that is a wide window where they can find multiple opportunities across different sectors. But again, it boils down to how the policies are set. The policymakers today, whatever they're going to come up with policies, they're going to impact those societies in the next decades to come, and how the policies will be inclusive and not just focusing on the big capitals and the big cities across the region. I mean, the entire community needs to have the platform, and I believe that everybody can bring in something positive, but they need a window, they need a platform, they need to be trained, they need a chance to do that. I'll give you one example. You look at the level of productivity, and Jihad in his opening remarks alluded to that, the level of productivity. I'll pick an example, the level of productivity, for example, in the agriculture sector in Egypt. with basic technology. I'm not going to go into remote sensing or precision agriculture and those advanced sort of technologies, but even basic technology can transform the volume produced, but also the use of the timing and resources available to produce much more volume year in, year out. So I go back 4 categories, and in my mind, more or less, the entire region can fall into these categories with a few exceptions. There is always, in every single society in the region, a segment that is very advanced in the adoption of technology and digitalization, but that's the smallest section. And then you move to the second category, which is growing and promising, and these are the future change agents, entrepreneurs, and risk takers who are actually venturing into the unknown and coming up with startups that are actually positively affecting our lives. The third, which is the third category, which is sporadic adoption of e-government, and we see obviously examples that are much better than examples. And the last category, which I insist is the most important, which is the drive of the economy, which is the private sector, which I see, which is predominantly based on SMEs, are still scratching the surface, if any, when it comes to adoption, real adoption of digitalization that can create an economic value.
Monica, I want to give you an opportunity to address the 2 audience questions, but also let me just put this to you because it's important. This region is vulnerable to volatility in the international capital markets. How can domestic financial institutions or domestic financial structures be reformed to spur capital market development across this entire region? Let's remember this is a region of many countries who are at many different stages in their development.
Absolutely. And I think capital market development has been a key area for some governments to focus on. And I think that provides a blueprint for other governments as well. We've seen a number of different areas of reform. So, for example, stock market reforms in Saudi Arabia in 2019 and 2020 that supported MSCI EM inclusion, also the FTSE one, and that's been very important for capital inflows. Next year, we'll see Egypt also joining the JP Morgan EM bond market index, and that's going to be very important for broadening access to capital and deepening markets there. Again, you know, these are all very important at a time when we're talking about rolling back the state and access to capital. Abu Dhabi and Saudi are seeing a lot of IPOs, which not only unlock capital and support investments, including, as Jihad has mentioned, you know, we're seeing a lot of investments going into renewable energy in the UAE, and that includes sales of oil sector assets to support that as well. But I think also one thing that's going to be very important for development of capital markets is really setting up a large institutional investor base within the GCC and MENA region. So pension schemes, etc., would be very important for accessing savings in the region, capital, and also reinvesting it as well into the real economies as well. And I think to link that with the question of corruption, one factor that's going to be really important is also the legal framework, rule of law, transparency. These are not only important for the corporates here, but without this framework, access to capital is going to be very, very difficult. So I think it's both sort of reforms, but also transparency, and that goes on a corporate level as well. And I think those are very, very key developments that we're seeing happening and need to be extended to the wider region.
Just picking up, thank you. Just picking up something that Monica just alluded to there, which is effectively the sort of pivot to clean energy. Certainly in the UAE, again, we see ambitions, significant ambitions in Saudi, for example. This is not consistent across the board, but the energy sector globally, Badr, going through a stark transition. The Gulf region, of course, still relies on fossil fuels. We are seeing evidence of that pivot, as I say, but how does the region's energy sector, and this will be a final question, transform while balancing what are the social contracts in this region, the economic, social, and indeed the environmental impact. Your perspective, if you will.
As you say, Becky, countries across the world are starting to experience the effects of years of confused energy policy, which led to an underinvestment in critical components of our energy system and the resultant crunch that we're facing today, which is in turn putting a massive strain on energy importing nations globally. For years, I and many others have been advocating for sensible energy policy that supports a greener evolution of energy systems whilst ensuring that we do not put energy security at risk or impede the economic and social progress of developing nations around the world. What this entails, broadly speaking, is first an acceleration of the coal to gas switch, natural gas substituting for coal-fired electricity in the past 5 years, reduced global CO2 emissions by 100 times more than all the electric cars in the world today. Second, cutting methane emissions and fast. Methane's found in the atmosphere as only 0.5% of the volume of carbon dioxide, but it accounts for 25% of the temperature rise. Third, I think rolling out of locally fit for purpose renewables, whilst of course continuing to invest in R&D to bring generation and transmission costs down, and very importantly also develop economic large-scale energy storage solutions. And in the meantime, where intermittency is a problem, which it often is, then pairing renewable technology with gas makes huge sense. And then a stronger push towards greater energy efficiency, including by adopting new energy tech. Also, of course, encouraging more sustainable consumption habits. Eating habits is an interesting one. The world today eats over 50 billion animals and 150 million tons of seafood every year, which accounts for about 15% of global emissions. And a final point, which my wife won't forgive me unless I mention, and that, of course, is protecting and restoring natural ecosystems. Deforestation accounts for about 15% of net global CO2 emissions. That's about the same as every single car, truck, bus, plane, ship, and train on the planet combined. And despite that, since 1990, we've been losing forest area the size of the UAE every single year. So again, this is all achievable, I think, with smart energy policy as opposed to politicized rhetoric.
Right.
And as you mentioned, Becky, the UAE's landmark net zero pledge and related strategy of going net zero by 2050, I think is a great example of a practical and conducive policy that relies on a mix of renewables, natural gas, hydrogen, and nuclear, of course, to ensure that the 3 A's of affordable, accessible, and acceptable energy is available to all.
For those who don't know, Bader's wife is a global leader in environmental issues. So you can now go home and feel that you will, the door will be wide open to you, sir. Thank you for that. I just want to wrap here with one final question to you, Jihad, and we literally have 60 seconds for the answer. The IMF program, widely seen as the only way to unlock foreign financial help for Lebanon, which it so desperately needs at the moment. I want to just give you 60, 75 seconds just to address where we are at with that before we wrap this up. That's so important.
What will unlock the situation in Lebanon is a credible reform package that is supported by all the stakeholders, that addresses the multiple issues that Lebanon is facing. And with that, I'm sure that the international community and the regional support will be there.
That's a conversation that you and I will continue at a later date, I'm sure, on the show. You are all more than welcome to join me at any point on Connect the World on CNN. This has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much indeed. What's clear to those who are watching this is that the digital divide, vaccine inequality that now exists, these issues need to be bridged. The public and private sector have so many lessons to learn from this pandemic. The risks are clear, but the opportunities are out there, aren't they? From here on out, collaboration key, that vaccine drive has been proof that businesses can do their part. Opportunities do exist in this crisis. Data-driven policies can help drive out corruption, as we've discussed, inefficiency, even improve governance. Governments can reform, moving away from broken practices. Energy efficiency is a goal that can be achieved as climate change becomes a bigger risk. All of this we have discussed. It's been an absolute pleasure having what has been a terrific panel today. I hope you've all enjoyed listening to our guests who have painted a clear picture for us of the challenges that the region faces, but also those opportunities that exist too. From me, Becky Anderson, it is a very good afternoon. Thank you.